नमस्कार, आदाब, सत श्री अकाल दोस्तों। स्वागत है आपका एक बार फिर से हमारे YouTube चैनल ब्रास फ्यूजन्स पर, जहां हम आपके लिए एक बार फिर से लेकर आए हैं एक नया लेसन।
If all countries adopt to discard the doctrine of Renvoy unanimously, I didn't understand this. You said that if all countries use doctrine of Renvoy, or if all countries reject doctrine of Renvoy?
The discard as in they do not use, they reject it.
Yeah, they reject. In such a situation, look, either way now, most of the countries do that. A country like India, for example, what would India do in such a situation? Of course, it will use its own private international rules, refer to the laws of the foreign state. Of course, the law which was identified as the applicable law, using its own private international rules, and then take the final call that, you know what, this is the law which applies in a situation like this. So there is no Renvoy as such. Now, Renvoy fundamentally came with the intention of maybe eliminating that possibility. Maybe what if British court want to reach a conclusion very much similar to that of India. Very much similar dispute between India and Britain. A British private international rule suggests that Indian law would apply, and Indian private international rule suggests that British law would apply. Now, both the countries might apply applicable law in two different ways in the same dispute in the same subject matter. Now, what doctrine of Renvoy does is to eliminate this fragmented application of the foreign law, and say that, you know what, even if an Indian court would look into a situation like this, the matter would be decided by our own court. So I don't think the chances would be reduced. Forum shopping would be there. Even in a situation where doctrine of Renvoy is not there, it would be there. Okay, fine. So I think you understand. Manvi, is that part clear?
Sir, if it's okay with you, I just wanted to...
Please go ahead.
Summarize what I've understood. Is that when we apply single Renvoy is mostly when the other country does not apply that doctrine, and to create uniformity of the application of law between these two countries. And in the same vein, double Renvoy would be applied where both countries have the doctrine of single Renvoy, and therefore to make sure that at the end of the day, had it been one or the other, at the end of the day, the matter would be heard by the same court. Is that...
decided by the same law.
By the same law. Sorry, yes, that's what I meant. By the same law.
Yes.
Okay, sir. I think I've got it, sir. Thank you.
In fact, I was sharing this with your classmates in the other section, section A and B or C and D. I don't know which section is this. I think this is C and D. So A and B. This is like the biggest success of 2020. To at least explain this idea of Renvoy to the class, and without a board and without any aid, because it becomes extremely interesting in classroom, and I thoroughly enjoyed dealing with Renvoy last semester with your seniors. I wish we were in classroom, but at least there's finally some good news in 2020 that I have attempted to give an explanation to doctrine of Renvoy, and I'm tired with it as well. Manvi, you have something to say?
No, sir, just that, thank you, because I think during single Renvoy, I was a little confused as to why there was a need at all. And now, since you've explained double Renvoy, I think I've understood now exactly why the doctrine came into being.
Okay, now, I think Manu's question was very helpful, because the question which he asked, I think that also really helped me understand the problem. The exact gap which we were not able to reflect. Can we say that double Renvoy and no Renvoy lead to similar effective result as to the choice of substantive law? All right, that's an interesting question. You say that the double Renvoy. Let's think about the same issue, that a British court would fundamentally refer to a French law, will revert the matter back, and will revert the matter back again to the French, merely because that is a likely conclusion. That is what it looks like. I mean, at least going by the example which we have taken, that looks like, can anyone think of a situation where that might not be the case? Yeah, it is a step further, I would say that. I mean, it is a step further in the sense that in principle, I mean, at least broadly, I might agree with you. But the use of word negation, at least in a theoretical sense, I would avoid it and say that it is. Okay, now maybe instead of using the word negation, what I would say is that it is to take care of the application of single renvoi in both the jurisdictions. So that is something which I would say, just to make sure that because of the application of single renvoi in the foreign country, the nature of applicable law does not change. The applicable law remains the same, even if the matter was being decided by the foreign court. That is what I would say. But yeah, broadly, I would agree with you. Although I would be a bit careful with the use of the terminology. Manu, by no renvoi do you mean the internal law of France would apply in this case? Yeah. So by no, fine. That's more of a clarification. Yes. So Manu, that is what my initial conclusion would be with regard to your question, which I find to be very interesting. I wish we had case laws from India to maybe study. I wanted to invoke some case laws, but then I think I've dragged the first module a bit too much. I was having a chat with my colleague, and he said that. I mean, he literally said that maybe you are trying to be a bit more innovative here, because all these parts are not very necessary for the purposes of your syllabus. But I believe that unless you understand these things, it would be difficult for you to go to specific instances and solve the private international law dispute, and then it might become more confusing. So that's one of the reasons why I spend at least 2 to 3 weeks on the first module, so that our basics are clear before we move to the core modules of private international law. All right, if that is the case, then we move on to the last aspect of this module, that is proof of foreign law. I hope this part is clear. I hope I have been able to reflect on all the questions. I'm open to discussion on all those aspects again. Now, we go to the last aspect of this particular module, and then from next class onwards, we can start with domicile. Now, when we say that there are different stages of private international law, what do we really mean? When we say there are different stages of private international law, what we really mean is that we start with jurisdiction, we go to applicable law. Within applicable law, we have seen that there are different sub-stages, classification. Maybe if at all there is an incidental question, there is a particular way of solving such situations. We further saw that how certain jurisdictions might use renvoi, although it looks like that renvoi seems to be limited only to few jurisdictions now. Now, we go to the next step, and that is we identify which law is to be applied. So after doing all those things which we have covered in the preceding lectures, we have identified that yes, the following law would apply in a situation, or the following law is going to apply in a dispute. But how do we prove the foreign law? How are judges who are basically based in India, they are going to prove the foreign law? This is the significant issue. Sure, sir, got it completely. It seems at least okay. Are there any concerns? Okay, it looks like you are fine with it. But either way, if there are any concerns, maybe we can talk about it subsequently. Now, when it comes to proof of foreign law, what we are actually talking about is a situation which is akin to identifying the exact law. What is the point? Identifying that yes, say French law dealing with succession to movable property would apply is one thing. But what is the French law dealing with succession to movable property? This is the precise law which would apply in a situation like this is something which is important for us here. So our next part is to understand this notion of proof of foreign law. How do we prove that this is the foreign law in a situation at hand. Now, Indian law dealing with, say, proof of foreign law is very close to how English law in relation to proof of foreign law is placed. In fact, entire private international law is broadly similar with minor differences. And what I propose to do, therefore, is that first I will identify the broader principles emerging from British practice, and then we will try to look at the provisions of Indian Evidence Act to see how India has tried to codify some of those principles or some of those points, which I'm going to mention one by one. Point number one, when it comes to proof of foreign law, is this: that when we are talking about proof of foreign law, what is important for us to remember is that proof of foreign law is considered as a question of fact and not question of law. That's the first point. This is the first point which we all must remember. Now, before I move forward, can one of you explain the difference between question of fact and question of law?
When there is a legal issue to be determined in terms of a legal principle, that's a question of law. And when a fact itself is disputed, and to determine which fact is true and which is false, that's a question of facts.
All right. Oh, thank you so much. It's wonderfully done. When it comes to the question of law, we are fundamentally concerned with, say, identification and interpretation of a norm. So norm has to be, necessarily, the law prescribes that it is of general application. When it comes to question of fact, what we are really worried about is the identification of what really happened in a dispute. And unless we decide the relevant facts of the case, of course, application of law would become very futile. Now, this is very interesting. When it comes to, say, application of, or when it comes to, say, interpretation of this term called with the knowledge of in Indian Penal Code where murder is defined. Now, that would fundamentally become a question of law, because we are only concerned with how identification and interpretation of a law is to be placed. Interestingly, when we have identified the law which is going to apply in a dispute at hand, in such a situation, the proof of that particular foreign law is not considered as a question of law, but a question of fact. So a fiction is created there. A fiction is created there where the foreign law or identification of a foreign law is considered not as a legal question, but a factual question. That's the point which I wanted to make. The fundamental basis of this particular idea, or this point which I'm trying to make, that proof of foreign law is considered as a question of fact and not question of law. The fundamental basis of this is that a judge is not supposed to have knowledge of foreign law. So you cannot, of course, impute the fact that a judge does not know foreign law and therefore it seems to be problematic. No, one cannot do that. A judge is supposed to know the law applicable in its own jurisdiction. And it is for this reason, for the sake of convenience, that proof of foreign law is considered as a question of fact. Once it is a question of fact, then what happens? That's the major question. Fine, it is a question of fact. Then how do we determine that fact? Now, in British practice, which also seems to be the common law position in this regard, that the proof of foreign law is done through expert evidence. Just like, for example, whether a particular knife was used for murder or not, the fingerprints part of it, and all those technicalities which are used to decipher the exact facts. Similar logic applies to how, for example, foreign law is to be deciphered. So the proof of foreign law is done through expert evidence, or for example by other means. Now, what do I mean by other means? Is that maybe through examining certain official documents to the satisfaction of the judge which is looking at the application of that foreign law. Generally, it is said that British courts are reluctant about conducting their own inquiry on the authenticity of law. So, British court will hardly get into its own inquiry, its own interpretation of the foreign law, the what should it actually mean. It will not get into that exercise. It will examine the law only through expert evidence. That's one. Now, that's the second point. The third point which I wanted to make was that who can be an expert? Once we say that these are experts basically who are going to decide the matter, then, who can be experts in a situation like that? Now, the jurisprudence in relation to experts, it's fascinating. So Cheshire, in fact, lists down different kind of entities or persons who can be experts. One thing which comes out of the entire section on who can be expert is that academic expertise or academic degrees do not necessarily imply that one is an expert in a given area. That's one point which emerges out of the discussion. So, for example, a Roman Catholic bishop was considered as an expert on matrimonial law of Rome, for example. Similarly, a hotel keeper in London who used to work in Belgium as a stockbroker or commissioner of stocks, it seems, he was considered as an expert on Belgian law of promissory notes. Similarly, an ex-governor of Hong Kong was considered as an expert on marriage law, which is prevalent in Hong Kong. Similarly, a traffic police officer was considered as an expert on, say, how law relating to road traffic is placed in Canada. So what we see here is that there are a number of things. There are multiple things. There are multiple aspects, and practical experience is one aspect which the court seems to have taken into consideration. So generally, to put it in general sense, that it is the discretion of court based on a necessary analysis to determine who is an expert and who is not. There cannot be a watertight compartment that mere fact that one has academic degrees, he or she is an expert in a given field. Court has in fact rejected some of those opinions where people have wrote, where the experts who were there, they had authored books on a particular issue. So court, in fact, did not accept that particular position. So that's one part of it. That's the third point which I wanted to make. The fourth point, and perhaps the most important point which I want to make here, is that who has the onus of proving the foreign law? Now, the onus of proving the foreign law basically lies with the party which is relying on that particular foreign law. So if the plaintiff is relying on the foreign law, then the onus of proving what the foreign law is fundamentally on the plaintiff. But what happens in a scenario where plaintiff, or for example the other party, the defendant, does not make an argument about foreign law or fails to satisfy the court about the foreign law as to what is exactly the foreign law, or for example the question of proof of foreign law. In such a situation, that is, if the foreign law is not proved, and that too, as I said, by the party contending it, then the presumption is that the foreign law is same as that of lex fori. Let me explain this point. What I mean to say is that where a party fails to prove the foreign law, in such a situation, the presumption is that the foreign law is same as the law of the forum. So if the matter is before an Indian court and the defendant or the plaintiff is supposed to present the proof of foreign law, they have the onus of proof of foreign law lies on, say, one of the parties. Either they don't prove it or they don't prove it satisfactorily before the court, then the court will make a presumption. And the presumption would be that the foreign law is same as that of lex fori. That is Indian law in the example which we have taken. That's the point which I wanted to make. So these are the 4 points which are emerging out of the British practice. India broadly follows all these 4 principles. What we have is Section 45 of Indian Evidence Act.
So could
Yes.
we repeat 1, 2, 3, 4, the 4 principles shortly, briefly?
Sorry?
So could we repeat on 1, 2, 3, 4 point-wise the 4 principles that were enumerated? Seems I got only 3 of the 4. So which one I'm not sure.
I will just do that. The first is that proof of foreign law is considered as a question of fact and not question of law. The second is that it is done through expert evidence or, for example, some other means like examination of documents. Fundamentally, what emerges from the British practice is that British courts are reluctant to get into their own inquiry about the authenticity of foreign law. That's the second point. The third point was that who can be an expert? Once we say that it is done through expert evidence, that who can be an expert in such a situation? And we saw as to how academic expertise is not a necessary criteria of being identified as an expert. Court has, in many situations, in fact, in most situations, court has taken into consideration the practical experiences of different individuals who came as an expert. And the last and the fourth point was about the onus of proof of foreign law. That is, the onus of proof of foreign law lies on the party relying on it. That's one. And if the party fails to satisfy the court about the foreign law, then there would be a presumption on the part of the forum that lex fori, that the foreign law is similar to that of lex fori, and the court would apply lex fori to solve the dispute at hand. These are the 4 points. 1, 2, 3, 4.
So when we talk about the first point itself, which is proof of foreign law is considered as a question of fact and not of law, so it's not clear as to which stage of the conflict resolution process are we referring to. Are we trying to refer to the stage of selection of lex fori or the application of selection of the lex causae or application of the lex causae?
No, we are concerned about the application. So we are here now. We are not just talking about the general nature of foreign law. We are not talking about which the law of which country would apply. So all those questions are done away with. We are at the exact stage of applying the law itself. What is the exact law at hand? So we have classified the issue at hand. We say that, okay, fine, as per the classification, it looks like it is a succession matter. Further, we have identified that, okay, using private international rules, it looks like that law of France would apply, for example. Now,
it's not clear as to why after the stage of classification and after the stage of selection of the lex causae, both Cheshire and Govindraj seems to have skipped the stage of the crucial stage of application of foreign law. And they have jumped to the stage of enforcement of foreign judgments.
Yeah, there are.
Which should be a fifth stage. There should be a fourth stage in between, which is a very crucial application of foreign law, which is a question of fact rather than law. Isn't it?
Yeah, because they have, and as you rightly said, this is such an important step. How can they skip it? Because they have not skipped it, and they have written separate chapters on it. So they have separate chapters on this particular aspect of proof of foreign law. Maybe I'll try to. I'm very sorry. I mean, it's too many lectures here and there, and I often forget to share something which I really want to. And the folder seems to be increasing of all the things which I would like to share. So they have not skipped that part, Manu. There is a separate section altogether on proof of foreign law in both the books.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So you got the 4 points otherwise, right? I guess
That's good.
fine. So it's already 12:30.
The last point when you said the court will presume, so it will be the court shall presume or the court may presume. Is it the discretion of the court to presume that it is the same as lex fori, or is it the mandation on the court to presume that it is the same as lex fori? That's not.
Okay. As a matter, some common law that seems to be the position that court. I would say that court. I mean, court shall presume in that regard, because the party who is supposed to prove the foreign law is maybe unable to prove the foreign law in that particular situation. Now, if at all an argument has been made with regard to foreign law, and if there is a possibility of, say, clarifying that doubt further through evidences, like, for example, official publication from the other country is presented before them. Now, if there is a possibility of say, maybe identifying foreign law more precisely, then court will take into account that consideration. But where the confusion is quite large, where the party has not cared enough to argue, say, on the question of foreign law at all, in such a situation, court will immediately apply Indian law and solve the matter at hand. There are few exceptions in that regard. One is that, one emerging from an Indian court, where an Indian court actually went to the extent of interpreting Sri Lanka's civil procedure code to determine the foreign law. So there have been certain instances, but maybe can we really turn these instances into principles? Very difficult to say. But what emerges from the general position, it looks like, is the fact that where parties have not been able to satisfy the court about proof of foreign law, either through evidences or expert evidence, or have not even argued about it, and there's a big confusion about in terms of how the question of proof of foreign law is placed, court will apply Indian law to solve the dispute at hand, presuming that the foreign law is similar to that of Indian law.
दोस्तों, अगर आपको आज का लेसन पसंद आया हो तो वीडियो को लाइक करें। इसी के साथ अगर आपने अभी तक हमारा चैनल सब्सक्राइब नहीं किया है तो सब्सक्राइब के बटन पर क्लिक करिए और बेल आइकन दबाना ना भूलें, ताकि आपको एजुकेशन से रिलेटेड नए अपडेट्स मिलते रहें। और अधिक जानकारी पाने के लिए आप हमारे फेसबुक और इंस्टाग्राम पेज से भी जुड़ सकते हैं, जिसका लिंक डिस्क्रिप्शन बॉक्स में दिया गया है। धन्यवाद।